Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Dr. James Ludes, who is Executive Director of the American Security Project in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Dr. Ludes.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for joining us today. For the benefit of readers who aren't as familiar with your organization, tell us a little bit about the American Security Project, when it was established, and what its goals are.
Sure. Well, the American Security Project is about 4 years old. It's a bipartisan initiative to transform the way the public thinks about and the way we as a nation ultimately achieve our national security. Our board of directors is composed of prominent Democrats, Republicans, retired general officers, people who have dedicated their lives to serving this nation. They're unified in a belief that the United States faces a series of challenges that aren't best met by the Department of Defense alone. But too often what passes for informed discourse in the country really focuses on how quickly can we blow up a problem, literally blow it up. And so the board has set out to identify challenges that are new and novel, and to describe an approach to meeting them that relies on things other than the Department of Defense, like diplomacy, economic development, foreign assistance, and just the assets and talents of the American people.
Now, bipartisanship used to be a given in American politics. Today, it's more of an uphill battle. How are you working through this challenge, and how's the bipartisan effort progressing?
Well, it is honestly, it's very heartening. We've done a lot of work on various issues. A couple of years ago, the board wanted to sort of establish a framework for the work that we do, and we developed a report called A New American Arsenal. And the board identified 4 principal national security challenges facing the United States in the first half of the 21st century. They included terrorism, proliferation, climate change, and energy security. And in the course of drafting that document, we had people who had to give and people who were willing to modify what their previous public positions had been. We had people who had never said anything about climate change come out and not only identify it as a national security issue, but recognize publicly for the first time that it was man-made. We had others who had never said a kind word about the nuclear power industry, who now publicly will say that nuclear energy is part of the near-term solution on climate change because it's such a low-carbon, high-energy source of power in America. So what we found is that in working through the issues privately and candidly, away from the cameras, away from the glare of the headlines, we were able to find a consensus that people were willing to rally around.
And is it your sense that we are gradually moving back toward a bipartisan conversation, or is that goal for another year?
I think that the reality is that the politics in Washington are fundamentally broken, in that there is once upon a time elections had consequences, and that if a party came into power, they were able to advance their agenda. And now that seems less and less the case. And part of that is, one of our board members is Ken Duberstein, who was President Reagan's chief of staff. He tells stories about the working in the White House in the 80s and the relationship that the White House had with Speaker Tip O'Neill, a giant of a Democrat in the 20th century. And they had to work with him, and they did work with him. Didn't mean that they disagreed fundamentally on a lot of issues, but on the issues that were important to the American public, they had to work together, and they did. I think that's a lesson that we could all relearn again, given the agenda that we face, whether it's healthcare or climate change or jobs or what have you.
Well, speaking of climate change, we at the university have been interested in the connection between climate change and national security for some time, but that particular combination of topics hasn't yet, reached out to the majority of the viewers. I would imagine they understand the environmental impacts or the argument for the environmental impacts of climate change, but maybe not necessarily the security connection. So, summarize for us what you think are the key security aspects of climate change, and what parts of those are we seeing already?
Sure. Well, climate change, it's unique to think about climate as a national security risk. But really, what we're talking about is what is the world that we're creating, And how is conflict going to be made worse? How are crises going to be made worse because of changes in the Earth's climate? Fundamentally, when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about water. Either too much of it in some places or too little of it in some places, with a cascading series of consequences that follow from it. Whether it is crises in the cultivation of food, displacement of people because there's just no fresh water, political instabilities because of diminished river flows. There are a whole host of things that can happen if these projections about climate change hold true. Now, the fact of the matter is that the science of climate change has been under assault in recent months. At best, I think we can describe some of it as scientists behaving badly. But it is something that I think we all have to be open-minded about and say, science is always a work in progress. That new evidence, new data, new theories are always put to the test and challenge the existing assumptions. That's the way it should be. From a national security perspective, though, we're less worried about having the 100% certainty about what's going to happen to the climate than managing risk. That's fundamentally what the national security community is asked to do on a daily basis when they're not fighting wars. They're asked to manage risk. And if you look at the environment and you say, we expect these X number of things to happen that are going to complicate the international security environment over the next 10, 15 years, what are the things we need to begin doing now to begin to meet those challenges?
And what are some of those things we ought to at least be thinking about now?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of the big granddaddy of them all, which is you got to do something about carbon, and you have to do something about either pricing it or disincentivizing. Right now, industries, individuals, everybody who drives a car just dumps carbon into the atmosphere. There's going to be a societal cost to that in the not-so-distant future when we start dealing with the consequences of climate change. So the big legislative proposals now are really focused on how do you price carbon so we start bearing some of that cost now so that we don't have to deal with the worst consequences downrange. But for the instruments of national power, there are a lot of specific things. The Department of the Navy right now takes climate change seriously enough that they've created a task force climate change. It's in the office of the Chief Oceanographer of the Navy, and their mission is to take a look at everything from what do changes in the Earth's oceans because of climate change mean for operating submarines. If there's going to be a Northwest Passage with ships transiting the North Pole on a regular basis, what does that mean for the way naval vessels operate? And how do you construct their hulls? We know that the horizon on climate change is 10, 20, 30 years. But it takes 20 years to design an aircraft for the United States Air Force, and you've got to operate it for another 30 years. So we're talking about impacts that are going to be felt in the time span and the lifespan of a lot of the weapon systems that we're buying for hundreds of billions of dollars.
Now, how do you persuade somebody about this threat in the context of the scientists behaving badly that you were just referring to a few minutes ago?
Well, the former Army Chief of Staff, Gordon Sullivan, talked about the lack of certainty. There are a lot of people who say, look, the science is not ripe enough. I disagree. But they say that the science is not ripe enough, that we need to wait and see, that at some point we'll have that certainty, and that's the time to act. And what General Sullivan has said quite effectively, I think, is that if you wait for 100% certainty on the battlefield, something bad will have happened. And by all accounts, we already see evidence of changes in climate affecting the international security community. Mm-hmm. The chief example is that we've seen in the Darfur region, there's been a 30% diminishment in rainfall over the last 30 years. That diminished rainfall led to competition for land. That land led to the political crisis that led to the camps, that led to the Civil War. These things are all related, and you can't just divorce one from the other. I'm not saying that climate change caused Darfur, but it certainly changes in the climate were a contributing factor.
Mm-hmm. Now, Florida has a lot of ports and coastal military facilities. How would climate change potentially affect those?
You have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, and of course, a lot of it depends. When you're talking about coastal facilities, you're principally asking questions about what will happen if sea levels rise. There are some U.S. facilities around the world that are a lot of jeopardy. Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, which is an important operating hub for U.S. and British forces. operating in Central Asia, so in Afghanistan and in Iraq also. And it only sits a few meters above sea level. And if some of these projections about the melting of glaciers in the Antarctic and in Greenland hold true, then you're going to see a rise in sea level that will swamp most of that facility. That'll have huge operational impacts for the United States military and our allies in the region. In Florida, again, it depends on how high the water actually comes. But typically with any facility, you're talking about cement piers. They don't float. So if the sea level rises, the piers don't. At some point, they become submerged, and then they become hazards rather than useful instruments of commerce or of mooring your ships.
What are some other national security aspects of climate change that people may not be focused on at the moment?
I think that the thing that's most amazing to me is, as I've looked at this, and we've been looking at this now for about 2 years, is that there is a history. We talked about bipartisanship earlier, but there's a history that goes back to the Reagan administration of the senior members of government in the national security community in the White House looking at climate change for what its impact would be on the nation writ large, which is national security. So whether it is a series of White House task forces, whether it is the task force climate change the Navy has, whether it's the Bush administration's final national defense strategy identifying climate change as one of the 4 key shapers of the international environment, or the national intelligence community saying that climate change will affect U.S. national security, or the CIA now opening an office for the study of climate change. There is a seriousness in the national security community because the consequences are so potentially grave that they're taking this very seriously. To me, that's a wake-up call that the rest of us as a country need to wake up and take it seriously as well.
You mentioned Iraq just a few minutes ago in the context of this broad climate change discussion. Tell us about the Institute's work in the area of Iraq and some of the recent research on that topic.
We did beginning about 2 years ago, we began asking prominent Americans, what's the single most important lesson the United States should learn from Iraq? And the answers sort of ran the gamut. We got responses from people who are retired military officers, senior American politicians. We had the Archbishop, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, religious leaders, business leaders, strategists, just thoughtful people. And their responses sort of ran the gamut. A couple of things that leapt out, we published this just recently in a book called Iraq Uncensored. The book is just these essays, and they're all short, they're very readable, very accessible. But they run the gamut from whether or not we should do more operations like Iraq to how we would do them better if we had to do them again. But probably most passionately were a couple of essays that pleaded with us never to do it again, that Iraq was not a good idea executed poorly. It was a horrible idea from the start.
So as you look to the future, what are your concerns, questions, projections for Iraq? Are we moving in the direction of the end of the game, or is this going to be reasonably open-ended despite the fact that troops are officially going to be coming out?
I think that the elections on March 7th in Iraq were tremendously important. The fact of the matter is that the problems inside Iraq are never going to be solved by the U.S. military. There are Iraqi problems. They need to be solved by the Iraqis, whether it's the hydrocarbon law and how you're going to share oil wealth between the various parts of the country, or it's how you manage the regionalism that's endemic with the Kurds and the Sunnis and the Shia. Fundamentally, these are political problems. What we have seen emerge over the last couple of years, truthfully, and I come to this conclusion very carefully, is the creation of a political class in Iraq. They don't always get along. They negotiate in a very hard-nosed manner. They don't always get a lot done. It's a lot like Washington in that respect. but their place of battle is in parliament. It's not in the streets. A lot of the ethnic violence, a lot of the civil war that we've seen over the last 7 years in Iraq, it's over. And instead of competition, you're finding political consensus emerging around some issues, tough negotiating on other issues, but fundamentally it's a political process. That's good for the United States. It's even better for the Iraqis.
Now, terrorism has been a prominent feature of the environment in Iraq from the beginning, and I know that's one of the prominent areas of emphasis for your institute. In fact, you publish an annual report called Are We Winning, which we have certainly used here at the University of Central Florida as one of the resources for our terrorism studies program. Tell us a little bit about the Are We Winning and Are We Winning?
Yeah. Well, we started Are We Winning because there was it's cliche now that there's not going to be a signing on the deck of the battleship Missouri, Tokyo Harbor, signaling the end of the war on terror. How do you know if you're making progress? You can't look at a map and say, okay, we're almost to Berlin. We're closer than we were before. So this new type of national security challenge required a new way of communicating whether or not we're making progress. So about 4 years ago, we set out to try to identify metrics that were observable, repeatable, and open sourced, of course, to indicate whether or not we're making progress in the fight against Al-Qaeda. And so we titled it simply, Are We Winning? We've got 10 measures of effectiveness, everything from the number of terrorist incidents to terrorist financing to the health of the Al-Qaeda movement. And we color code them. We present it in a very simple and accessible format. It's all available to anybody who's interested at americansecurityproject.org. But fundamentally, we have tracked rather disturbing trends in the number of terrorist incidents occurring globally. Those numbers have not diminished. In fact, they're grown exponentially over the last several years, and that, in our estimation, is associated with a decentralization of Al-Qaeda. This isn't particularly novel for people who follow terrorism studies, but clearly Osama bin Laden and his lieutenants are less important, and what's more important are these cells and these organizations that have sprung up around the Middle East. Now, especially, we're interested in what's happening in Yemen and what's been happening in Yemen, because the energy and the dynamism of the movement is not with Al-Qaeda Central anymore. It's really with these other organizations that are recruiting, training, and now we know, because of the Detroit bombing, dispatching operatives to try to do harm to Americans all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, somebody might be looking at this report and say, how do you measure something such as terrorist financing? Because that is such an obscured area. It's hard enough for governments to monitor this.
When we began doing this, we actually brainstormed upwards of 20 criteria that we, in an ideal world, in our wish list, would have been able to get data on and be able to make really informed judgments. And in some cases, we just found that the data was not available. There's a whole world of intelligence data that's highly classified that we just don't have access to. But you can make some judgments. The United Nations has done some reporting. The U.S. Department of Treasury has done some reporting about the amount of terrorist financing that we have tied up through various seizures. And there are sources out there. What we do with this report is we're not trying to tell anybody we're winning, we're losing, although that's the clear question. We want people to look at the data themselves, and they can conclude for themselves whether or not the data that we presented presents a compelling picture of progress or lack of progress. On balance, I think that we've made some important progress in the last couple of years, but the big thing that keeps me up at night is the fact that Islamist terrorism around the world continues to skyrocket.
Now, in terms of your terrorism research for the coming year or two, will you maintain this same focus, or will you look at other things? Are there new topics on the horizon?
We will, on this project in particular, we'll continue to look at the fight against Al-Qaeda and how it is changing and morphing. was asked a question earlier today about whether or not getting Osama bin Laden would really be the end of the war on terror. And I don't think anybody really thinks that that's it. The energy in Al-Qaeda is, as I said, not with bin Laden anymore. He still has a very important role to play. But that movement will, and I'm afraid, persist beyond his demise.
What do you think about the average American's interest in the terrorism subject? I know it was high immediately following 9/11, now not so much, in part because you usually hear people say there hasn't been a major incident in the United States, and from that they draw the wrong conclusion that the threat has perhaps diminished. But can you help us understand what the threat is? And
I think that I think the threat is very real, and I think that what's a surprise to a lot of people, I think, is that there haven't been more attacks, and there haven't been any successful attacks since 9/11. And there are a lot of different theories about what that may mean, but I think a lot of that's just speculation. What we do know is that there continues to be a threat from a group of individuals who very much wish to do the United States harm. And the type of harm that they'd like to inflict on us is not just, I'm afraid to say just, but it's not simply dispatching a gunman into a mall. They're looking for an attack that is really going to undermine some of the pillars of the American economy. That's what happened on 9/11. That's what we see in another attack on air travel and in Detroit. And I think it's a threat that's going to persist for some time. And I think it's one that the public cannot become sanguine about. It's real, and we need to keep our eyes open to it.
because oftentimes when you ask the question, are we winning, if people are satisfied with the answer and they think it's that maybe we are doing a little bit better, the next question they typically ask is, are we safe?
Right. It's a different question.
Different question.
Yeah.
But they often come together in the same conversation. And so are we safer than we were prior to 9/11?
I think that the fact that we're more vigilant makes us somewhat more safe. I worry, though, about a certain sense of complacency. Conflict throughout history is always characterized by periods of offensive innovation and defensive innovation. And so we have now pretty much sealed up the cockpits. We have hardened the cockpit doors. We have said you can't carry your explosive liquids or your nail file on board planes anymore. So this guy flying into Detroit packs his underwear full of a powder that's explosive. That sort of competition is always going to exist. But I do think that the general sense of vigilance, that the public is more aware. And so, whether it's the shoe bomber Richard Reed or the incident in Detroit, it was the passengers on board who were acutely aware of the threat who responded immediately at the first sign of trouble. It wasn't TSA, it wasn't the border police, it wasn't the special forces. It was the people on the plane who took matters into their own hands because they had to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, there are many more of the things we could talk about, but on that note, I think we'll conclude and continue our conversation at a later date.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ludes. And thank you for the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.